Hi, Donovan. I'm a cop in the state of Oklahoma. I've been a cop for about 10 years, and I'm not going to tell you my name or exactly where I work for obvious reasons. I was working the night shift, which is from 3 p.m. till 11 p.m. It was about 9:30 p.m., and I was driving down a road that is heavily wooded on both sides. The trees are very tall and thick, so it's hard to see through them at night. There's no streetlights in this area because it's a pretty rural area. As I approached this intersection, I saw something standing in the middle of the road about 50 yards ahead of me. Since there were no streetlights and it was very dark out there, and all I could see was something standing in the middle of the road with its arms stretched out like it was trying to stop traffic or something. As I got closer to this thing, I realized that it wasn't human. It had long black hair covering its body, and its face looked like a wolf's face with big pointed ears sticking up from its head. It stood upright on two legs like a man, but it had these huge feet and hands with claws on them. It also had a very muscular upper body. This thing surprised me so much that I slammed on my brakes and stopped right in the middle of the road. I sat there for a few seconds trying to figure out what it was, but I had never seen anything like that before. As I sat there, it turned around and looked right at me. It seemed to be surprised that I had stopped because it took a couple steps towards my patrol car as if it was going to come after me. That's when I realized that this thing didn't want me to see it. But there was not much I could do at this point because I'm sitting there in the middle of the road and it's walking towards my car. I got out of my patrol car and drew my weapon. I shot it 3 times, twice in the chest and once in the head. I only grazed its head though, but my shots were dead center on this thing's chest. It lets out this very strange and odd yell like it's screaming but sucking air at the same time. Then it takes off running into the woods. It started running on its hind legs, but after a few strides, it got down on all fours. I could see it stumbling into the woods. I knew I injured it badly. I could see a blood trail leading from the road to the woods, but I wasn't about to go after it in those thick woods. I radioed in for backup and explained the situation. Boy, that was a weird conversation with dispatch. They sent a team out to look for this thing. After I went back to the station to process some paperwork, my shift ended and I drove home for that night. I can tell you that I was wired when I got home. Obviously, I've never been in a situation like that before, and I just kept replaying the entire incident in my head over and over again. It was about 3 a.m. before I finally went to sleep that night. I was thinking about it so much before I went to bed that I actually had a dream about it too. Only in my dream I shot at it and it kept coming towards me. Then with one of its claws it swiped across my chest and made this huge gash. I was bleeding out really bad and I felt like I was going to die, and then I woke up. So the next day I wake up around noon because I didn't get to sleep until so late that night. It was actually the morning. As I was getting ready for work, I texted one of my friends who was on the team that went out to try to retrieve this thing. I asked him, "Did you guys retrieve that wolf?" There was no answer. After an hour goes by, still no answer. I thought it was a little odd because he always answers me back. Now he works the graveyard shift, but he's typically up by 2 p.m. every day because we text all of the time. So later that day I went into work and I was following up with one of my fellow officers, and he told me that they recovered this thing, and halfway through the FBI came in and took the creature off site. Now he wasn't on the team that my buddy was that recovered the animal, but he told me that it was some type of large wolf that was domesticated. The team that went out and recovered the animal was also debriefed. They were instructed not to discuss the details related to this thing to anyone. Sure enough, as I'm walking down the hall, my boss pulls me into his office and said, "I have a 3:30 meeting with someone from the FBI." It's 3:15 and I can see in one of our conference rooms a few men dressed in suits talking to the chief of police. When he exits, they signal for me to come over, and then they start asking me what happened last night, why I fired my weapon, what did I see, what time did it occur. Basically, every little detail we went over and over and over. They told me the same thing, that it was some large wolf that somebody was keeping as a pet in the area. They also told me not to discuss this with anyone and that they would be handling any press or media going forward. Obviously, I knew this wasn't just some wolf that somebody kept as a pet. This thing was massive, and I mean massive. It stood upright like a human does. Wolves don't have claws like this thing had. And they don't look like a silverback gorilla in the upper body. But something told me I should just go along with what they were saying, politely agree, and move on with my business. So after my discussion with them, I finally got a text back from my friend. And he said, "Did you have your meeting?" I responded, "Yes. Do you want to go get some coffee later?" He named the location of our usual spot and the time, and shortly after, we met up for some coffee around 5 p.m. I asked him, what is going on? What exactly is that thing? He said that it took 5 of them to haul it out of the woods, and it had to be at least 400 pounds. He went on to tell me that someone called somebody at the FBI because they arrived halfway through the extract and took over. They loaded this creature into a black van, and that's the last that he saw of it. This entire thing was so surreal, I couldn't believe it was happening in my small town. It just goes to show you that you never really know what's going on out there. Hi, Donovan. I work in law enforcement in the state of Wyoming. I've been on the job for over 15 years and have seen a lot of things. I was working as a patrol officer in the middle of Wyoming when I got the call about a possible domestic disturbance in an old farmhouse. It was called in by a nearby neighbor that some commotion and screaming was going on at the farmhouse. When we arrived, there were no cars in the driveway or around the property, so we assumed that it was just another false report. We knocked on the door and rang on the doorbell, but nobody answered. We decided to go around back to see if anybody was out there. As we walked around back, I noticed that all of the windows were covered with newspaper and tape, like someone didn't want any light getting inside or anyone looking in. We went to walk up to one of the windows when something caught our eye near one of the trees that lined up against one side of the house. There was what looked like a mannequin hanging from one of its arms from a tree branch, about 10 feet off the ground, but it looked different than any other mannequin that I've seen before. It had long black hair, it was painted white for its skin, and had very red eyes. This mannequin also had fangs mounted on its mouth. It looked like it was wearing a black dress with white lace around the bottom of it. My partner and I both looked at each other and said, "What the hell is that?" My partner said, "I don't know, but it sure is freaky." We went up to the window and could see through a small sliver through the newspaper that was covering up the window. When I looked in that window, I saw about 10 mannequins positioned all over the family room in odd poses wearing these crazy outfits, and they all had fangs mounted to their mouths and their eyes were painted red. My first thought was, what type of serial killer are we dealing with here? We couldn't really do anything because it's not against the law to have weird mannequins dressed up in your family room, but it sure was weird. We had to leave the scene after we tried knocking a few more times. We never heard anything coming from the inside. I'm sure whoever was there probably had video cameras on the outside of the house, and we just didn't see any. About 2 weeks later, we come to find out that the feds were tracking this guy and charged him with human trafficking and murder. He would kidnap people off the street and bring them to his farmhouse and torture them for days. He would then sell them or murder them. He was doing this for years and nobody knew. The guy was a real freak. I've never seen anything like that before. I'll never forget it as long as I live. I can still see those mannequin red eyes in my mind to this day. I had a good friend who did really well for himself. He lived on a huge ranch near the mountains of Wyoming. There's a lot of wildlife in that area. Deer, bear, that kind of thing. One year he needed to go on a trip out of the country for a couple of weeks and needed someone to watch over his house, water the plants, and take care of his 2 cats. I decided I would be crazy if I passed up the opportunity to stay in such a beautiful house stocked with food and an amazing view overlooking the town we both grew up in. This was the summer of 2014, and even though I was in college, I didn't have any classes that semester, and I didn't have much going on, so I figured I'd sleep over and watch the house while staying in one of the guest rooms. The first couple of days were pretty calm, just feeding the cats and making sure everything was locked. I'd sometimes invite some other of our friends over to hang out and swim in the pool and play ping pong. I was mindful not to keep any doors open, since the house was in the woods. Bears would often show up in his backyard, but as long as you yelled or waved your arms around, they were normally frightened off. One night, I was in my room and I was watching television. I kept the window open to let some cool, fresh air in, when suddenly an awful smell entered the room. One of the cats was on the bed with me, so naturally I started looking around to see if maybe it threw up or maybe it peed or pooped. But I didn't see anything, and actually the cat had lifted its head up too and was sniffing the air. I didn't find anything out of the ordinary in the room. That's when I went to the window to look out to see what might be out there. Maybe a skunk. But all was fine, at least from what I could tell, because it was basically pitch black on that side of the house. I started to call out for the other cat, but nothing. When I started thinking about it, I hadn't really seen him all day. I closed the window so that the cat on the bed wouldn't get out and looked for the other cat. When I left the room, I could hear something, really faint. It sounded like scratching or a rubbing sound. Now, mind you, this house has 7 rooms upstairs and 4 bathrooms. I checked each and every one of them and headed downstairs calling for the missing cat. I saw that his food bowl was empty, so he was definitely in the house, but he wasn't in the kitchen. Just then, a faint flash of light and some quick movement caught my eye outside by the pool. It looked like something was by the pool drinking water. I walked down the hallway leading to the sliding glass door that faces the pool, and there I found the cat, scratching like crazy at the glass door to get in. I could see a large hairy animal kneeling next to the pool, leaning over to take a drink. I couldn't believe a bear had made its way to the pool. I leaned in closer to the glass to look outside and to get a better look, but the silhouette I was looking at wasn't exactly a bear. I flipped on the light switch next to me to turn on the outside light. The creature slowly lifted its head and turned back towards me. This thing was massive, built like a linebacker but bigger, and hairy from head to toe with filthy dark brown hair. The pool water was dripping from its mouth as it stared back at me. The cat started to hiss. This beast looked back at me. Its face was sort of like a monkey or an ape. Then it ran off. Its strides were amazing, maybe 4 or 5 steps, and it was already out of my line of sight. I then felt safe enough to open the sliding glass door to get a better look at it running away. But boy, did I regret that. That awful smell from earlier, that smell was from that thing. I reeled back from the door, almost choking from the smell, and the cat bolted back inside. Outside, I could hear trees and bushes moving. What was crazier was that I could still hear its footsteps. Rapid, loud stomps as it ran off into the distance. I closed the sliding glass door and I locked it. There was a dark filth that sank to the bottom where it had been drinking. Thankfully, this smell had been blown off by the mountain breeze, but the creature had left behind a trail of dirt and fur. I walked over to the grass where it had taken off. There I saw the most enormous footprints that I have ever seen. The grass wasn't even wet or damp, which means this thing was heavy enough to press into the hard ground. The rest of the time there, nothing else happened. I fed the cats, cleaned the litter box, watered the plants, and every night I would wait around to see if this creature would come back. That thing never came back, and luckily I never smelled that smell again. When my friend finally came home, he asked how everything was. I didn't say anything about what I saw and said all was fine. I knew he wouldn't believe my story. I never really told anyone about it, but since then I've looked up these stories online that are similar to what I saw. All the research that I've done matches what seems to be a Sasquatch or a Bigfoot. They all line up with exactly what I saw that night. I've randomly asked my friend if he's ever seen anything strange out there, but he always says no. I've never taken care of the house again. I say no and then I'm busy with work or school, but it's always a lie. I just don't know what to do if that thing got into the house. What could you do?